Great. Okay, so the recording is going, and so then the last piece is just to note first that we're going to be sending an email to folks who are registered for, it'll say it's project outcome, and that's just a way for us to track ways that we can improve the programming that we do, and so please do respond to that survey to help us improve. Without any further ado, I just want to introduce Julia. Julia lives off the grid in the mountains of Western Maine, where she's a poet, farmer, editor, and small-town librarian. She's the author of 2 poetry collections, Midden, published by Fordham University in 2018, and Work by Bloodlight, published by the Cider Press Review in 2017. She's received honors including the 2019 and 2018 Maine Literary Awards, the 2016-2017 Poets Out Loud Prize, and the 2015 Cider Press Review Book Award. So without further ado, I just want to mute my line and hand it away to Julia.
Oh, thank you so much, Ben. And thank you all for joining me here today. This was a hard talk for me to write in a hard week. So I want to start the talk today by acknowledging the grief and rage and fear of our present moment. I want to acknowledge that for any Black, Indigenous, and persons of color in our audience. And I also want to say, for white people who are here with me today, that in large part I'm doing this talk because I really want to speak to you. Because I think we have a real responsibility right now with our sense in our history. We need some difficult conversations about what it takes to get us to that point. And I think we need to start rejecting familiar and comfortable narratives that absolve us from responsibility and action, and instead focus on writing directly into our discomfort with history. So that's what I'm trying to make this talk about today. In his 1953 essay, Stranger in the Village, James Baldwin wrote, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." These are the words echoing in my head as I sit down to write this talk. I write a single sentence. I stop, scroll through news feeds of police in riot gear violently attacking unarmed protesters. I read commemorations of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. I erase my sentence. I watch flames lick building walls and cars. I write another sentence. I read the staggering list of names, the Black men and women murdered at the hands of white supremacy, the white police officers and citizens who are never held to full account. I erase my sentence. The president advocates more police violence, threatens to deploy the United States military against its own citizens. I write another sentence. History, with its rusty metal jaws, squeezes tighter and tighter. It is on top of us now, pressing us in on feet to catch our ankles. It is inside of us, even when we don't want to acknowledge it. If history is a trap, then the question I am bringing to this page and talk today is, how does one write from a trap? How do we identify the metal jaws of history, push down the rusty levers, and pry them apart? And how can we attempt to do so responsibly? I do not believe it is possible to write about history without confronting its violence. And I do not believe it is possible to write about the violence of history without first confronting the silence that so often surrounds this violence, coding and distorting our perceptions and narratives. Because it is silence that helps us to keep the past safely in the past. Silence that presses history neatly behind sheets of glass until we forget it is a living, breathing entity and begin to regard it instead as a collection of distant artifacts or a row of beautifully pinned, pressed, dead butterflies. So if we're to talk honestly today about writing history, then we must first acknowledge our position within the present. And we must examine critically the distance or proximity we place between ourselves and the past. When we close ourselves off from history, when we say the past should remain in the past, or I refuse to live in the past, we contract vital spaces within ourselves, and we tighten the trap. But when we open ourselves to history, which is to say, when we open ourselves to its contradictions and inconsistencies and messy, terrible tangles, when we allow ourselves to learn about the atrocities our ancestors committed and the atrocities our ancestors suffered, and accept that for many of us, it is not just one or the other, but both. When we acknowledge how one kind of harm always leads inevitably to another. When we identify all that we do not know and practice listening to the silences we unconsciously carry and perpetuate, we open up something inside of ourselves. But of course, this is much easier said than done. Here is a memory that has become a parable for me. It's late summer, 2011. I'm in Peru at the ruins of Kenko Temple, one of the largest huacas, holy places in the Cusco region. Archaeologists believe this is where the Incan dead were judged and perhaps embalmed, where blood sacrifices were offered to the gods. Here, the guidebooks tell us, it is not possible to visit without being touched by the air of mystery that permeates the site. We are led through a series of caverns built of massive, darkly shining rock to see a stone altar where sacrifices were once performed. There are grooves carved in the stone for the blood. I put my hands against the stone and tried to feel something, to summon the energy, the primacy, the horror of this cavernous temple's history. Because I'm a poet, I believe it is my duty to feel something here, in this place saturated with the sharpest moments of mortality and ritual. I think it's my job to reach out and touch it, to experience it, to make something of it. But there is no sudden shock, no surge of voices or energy. All I feel is the coldness of the rock beneath my palms. All I hear is silence. All I'm surrounded by is the distance of time and history. All I know is my own remoteness, my own lack of understanding. The poet's job is to have a conversation with silence. The poet Araceli Gourmet told me years later. But how do you have a conversation with silence? The same summer I visited Peru, I also began in earnest, after years of research and stalling, to try to write what would become my book, Midden. Midden explores the state of Maine's forcible eviction and erasure of an interracial community of 47 people, Black, white, and Indigenous persons, from their home on Malaga Island in 1912. Though Malaga had been their home for generations, 9 of the Malaga residents, including the entire Marx family, were committed to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded in Pownell. Almost all of those committed to the institution died there. The others, unwelcome on the mainland, struggled to relocate. The Tripp family was forced to lash their home to a raft as a makeshift houseboat, which led to the tragic death of Laura Tripp, the family's mother. Homes were taken down board by board. The Malaga school was dismantled. And in an ultimate act of violence, 17 graves were exhumed from the Malaga cemetery, consolidated into 5 caskets, and reburied at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded in unmarked graves. It took just 1 year to erase the Malaga residents from their home. But this erasure was reinforced by the century of silence that followed. Surviving families experienced and inherited an agonizing legacy of trauma in the isolation of secrecy. And many Mainers still don't know the story of Malaga Island to this day. The story of Malaga had haunted me since I first learned of it 5 years earlier. I had amassed notebooks and folders full of research in that time. I'd visited the island to listen to the archaeologists discuss their findings. I'd seen their open dig sites, long, sinister rectangles cut like grave sites into the shell pack. I had piles of Xerox newspaper articles. I plastered copies of photographs of the Malaga residents all over the walls around my desk. My research was a poet's research, which is to say circular and sometimes scattered, but it was obsessive. And yet, in 2011, I'd written only a small handful of poems, and most of them were terrible, clunky, heavy-handed, contrived, desperate. Whenever I faced the page, I felt as I had in the cave, my hands against the cold silence of the stone altar, concentrating in an effort to summon something, anything, and getting nothing. I kept asking, how do I turn research into something that sings and sears? How do I transform the cold silence of the archive into something physical, into a hand that can reach out and grab us? History choked me. History took hold of my throat, writes Nicole Cooley at the end of Archival Silence, the first poem in her book, The Afflicted Girls, a wonderful book of poems about the Salem witch trials. I longed for such visceral urgency in my own poems. I longed to feel such a connection to history that it might reach out and take a hold of my own throat, too. In hindsight, I can now clearly see the error of this. How my desire to feel and tell overshadowed my ability to listen. James Baldwin also wrote in Stranger in the Village that the root function of language is to control the universe by describing it. This is the narcissistic idealism of the writer. The stubborn belief that we can change the world through language, if only we can make our words pretty enough. The desire to be the one who writes the magic words that catch the spark, to play the hero. The risk here, beyond the inherent futility of this undertaking, is that when you try too hard to assign a simple narrative to the bleeding knot of history, when you get carried away with the act of telling or of demonstrating your knowledge, rather than listening to what the silence has to offer, you become a colonizer. In the early 1900s, A wave of exploitive and inflammatory journalism brought reporters from Maine and Boston flocking to Malaga to document the island and its people. The language of their articles was racist, provocative, dehumanizing, filled with exaggerations, rumors, and false stories. The photographs they took were labeled with racist captions and resold as postcards. All of this fueled public bias against the people of Malaga. And after the eviction, shame and fear took over and blanketed their story with silence. By the time I learned about Malaga, many regarded it as a story best left untold. Any discussion of writing creatively from history responsibly must first begin with recognizing and interrogating one's own impulse to tell, with acknowledging that telling can be as much of a violence as silence. When I began writing about the history of the Malaga Island erasure, I was keenly aware of myself as someone apart, as an outsider standing on the other side of history's window. I was someone who knew loss, sure, but I had never personally experienced such violent erasure. I was white. I was not a descendant. I was not even originally from Maine. I had no claim to the history beyond the simple fact that it haunted me. I initially and mistakenly saw the project as an antidote to the intensely personal poems I'd written thus far, as a way of trying to understand something beyond my own lived experience. But once I began the project, I started to understand that no one stands outside of history. In order to tell the story of Malaga properly, I had to recognize myself not as a remote viewer of history, but as an active participant. I had to figure out how to put myself in direct conversation with the past. If the past could remain safely in the past, it would not haunt us. Ghosts are ghosts because the violence of the past will not let them rest. Because the perpetuation of this violence in the present, whether it be through omission or commission, will not let them rest. We walk on top of ghosts daily. We carry them inside of us. Beyond research, the real work of writing Midden was the work of learning how to write my way inside this history, of finding ways to examine the complicity of my own white privilege, to explore my deep and growing connection with my own land, 85 hilly acres in Western Maine, to consider how vital that relationship is to my own narrative and sense of identity, to contemplate the utter loss it would mean for me to be separated from it, to interrogate the entire notion of land ownership. I had to probe my own doubts and fears about writing this story, my questions about whether doing so was appropriation, to ask myself again and again whether I even had the right to tell it as someone who had no direct ancestral ties. I had to confront what it meant for me to try to tell this history when it had already been told wrong so many times, and when these mistellings had led to so many generations of harm. Any act of creative documentation involves making choices. Which parts of the story to tell, which to leave out, which voices to amplify. Like gardening, the intention is to make things grow, but the process is inherently violent. You must tease apart the facts from the story, grown together like so many seedlings, gently, so as not to break the roots. You must pull the weeds, select which stories you want to nurture, into blossom. The turning point for me in writing my book was when I began a series of epistolary poems addressed to ghosts. In this series of Dear Ghost poems, which is more internal, often more stream of conscious than many of the other poems, and which runs like a vein through the book, I started to address my frustration, my distance, my uncertainties, my complicities, layer by layer. And I'm going to read the first one of these poems that appears in the book. Dear ghosts, I pick the list for names like herringbones from the fish's oiled cavity. I run them between my teeth, stroke the scarred light of photographs, your granulated faces, mimeographed eyes always left in the dark. I take up scissors, razor blades, the rusted garden loppers, pinking shears. I scissor you to islands, rearrange until my fingerprints peel your faces gray. I bind you to my walls. I let you hang. You watch me sleep, your silence a blood burst in my mouth. I dream of ink wake as a stain against my sheets. Finally, I shred the maps, scatter the portraits, watch you faceless flutter down. 100-year-old snow dusts the ground. This is our only blessing. Bury you in the yard. Sing as I fingernail our forgetting into the bone clay. The Malaga archive is a broken archive. It is messy, threaded through with silences, with fractures, with omissions and errors and gross exaggerations. Each time I thought I knew the whole story, I'd come across a new inconsistency, a date or name or spelling that didn't add up, a contradictory story, a new person I couldn't account for, a family who seemed to have disappeared from the documents without a trace. Some sentence I recalled reading but couldn't locate when I went back to confirm it. In many ways, the process of researching Malaga was like walking the same road day after day for years, only to stumble over some new remnant or sinkhole each time. Because this fracture is the result of a silence built decades and generations of shame, I came to realize that what I did not know and why I didn't know it mattered as much, if not more than, what I did know. My initial frustrations came from trying too hard to learn everything, from asking too loudly, from trying to fill in the silence with my own answers instead of learning how to listen to what the silence had to tell me. My poems improved when I tried not to answer the silence or to speak over it, but simply to hear it. I worked on writing into the horror of silence and the horror of fact simultaneously. I tried to cast my poems into the space between what I knew and what I did not and could never know. Because the residents of Malaga were stripped not just of their home, but also of their narratives. Their stories overwritten by inflammatory and exploitive journalism that both fueled their eviction and then actively silenced them afterward. It was crucial for me to try to amplify their voices without accidentally overwriting or exploiting them myself. I didn't know if this was even possible. I wrote many more poems than I knew would ultimately fit into the book. I experimented with as wide a range of forms as I could. I wrote personal poems written both in the voices of Malaga residents and in the voices of those who are complicit. Epistolary poems, an interview-style poem, sestina, erasure, ghazal, pantoum, fragmented prose poems. Not everything I've named even made its way into the book. All of these trying to balance the personal against history, trying to balance saying too much with saying too little. I tried to create a chorus of voices, the eyes competing and not always clear, to offer messiness instead of explanation. Because history is nothing if not messy, and poetry, where beauty is woven so inextricably to horror, is uniquely suited to honoring such messiness. When my mother read Midden, she said, "It reads as if you were When my mother read Midden, she said to me, "It reads as if you were faced with a story that was so terrible that there was no right way to tell it. So you tried every single way you could think of." I didn't fully realize until she said it that this was exactly what I had done. So I'm gonna break from the talk to read a poem one more time. And this is an excerpt. This is the first 3 sections of a poem that's written as an interview style called Interview with the Dead. Who were you then? And instantly the tongue becomes the prism of fracture, land of washed green light, ferns, wild hops, hemlock, lichen skinning the granite outcrops. And instantly the tongue becomes a well, a stone cast into memories falling. When there's no one left to name the helix of departure unfurling inside you, wear silence as a tattered shirt, a stain of torn buttons. We carried it in our spines and anyone could see it when we walked. And instantly the tongue turns to salt, white film and blanch. For not even the tongue can taste what came before salt. How do you remember your island? As stone fingers spread an octave into the sea. As salt brands ankles and red mud heels callous to clay. As dreams in which we still pick blackberries. As brambles scratch a map into our skin. As we thread the fishhook, pull the line taut. As a catch of blood in the back of the throat. As fingers tying a knot. How did you leave? Our houses became our bodies. We lashed ourselves to rafts. Our bodies became boats. Some left as cargo in boats, boxes. We wept or did not weep until home became the rubble between our teeth, the thing one cannot fight for fear of breaking. Then we were a people sculpted of wind, and when we left, we scattered as breath. Then we were a people carved of gravel and dust, and we left as the land, stripped from the land, carrying our hearts in our fists. If history is a trap, then it's silence that keeps the trap closed. It's difficult for me in this present moment where continued white silence about racial injustice equates to death, for me to think of silence as anything but evil. Silence is complicity. It is a reinforcement of power and acquiescence. It is forgetting. It is a denial of voice and thus of justice and of agency. Silence threatens to smother, to erase, to obscure our most vital stories forever, to gloss over the harms that history has wrought, to contort our identities. And of course, this threat of erasure is the measure against which we must always continue to create literature and art, because silence unchecked begets more silence. But in writing Midden, I also came to understand that silence is double-edged, that despite its function to erase, it also has the potential to serve as an access point, an aperture through which we might be able to view the world differently and more clearly. Writing a book that relied on research helped me to understand not just what we can learn and bring to poems from archive, but what we can learn and bring from the places where archive fails us, where it erodes into silence and fragment. The silences in the Malaga archive took me eventually into the silences that mark my own genetics. As a descendant of European Jews, the details of my personal history are different, but many of the patterns of removal and erasure are similar. Above all, the silence that runs through my family like a vein of quartz through granite. Silences like, what were the real names of my great-grandparents? Their countries of origin, their immigration stories. Where were their families killed? What did they leave behind? I know there was a farm. As a child, I thought it was a vodka distillery in Austria. Now I'm told it was in Kosovo. I had been told they worked it, but that it wasn't theirs, that Jews weren't allowed to own land. I have also been told that they had a good life, that they gave to the poor. The details I have are disparate and contradictory. On a scratchy VHS tape, my great-grandmother recalls running through rows of peas with her sisters. In the Yad Vashem Central Database of Shoah victims' names, I tried to find her eldest sister. The listing I think may be hers just says, first name unknown. In poetry, it is the space between words that emphasizes language. Silence adds bolster, strength, and catalyst to the words we do write. It allows them to linger and resonate, to reach the reader from across space and through time. Within silence, you can hear what no amount of research or list of facts can offer. As the poet Ilya Kaminsky writes, the voice we cannot hear is the clearest voice. I discovered that while silence in an archive is a fracture, it is also a doorway, a breath, a window. The places where the archive breaks down are the places where the poet's imagination is allowed to enter. In this sense, silence becomes the draft of air that moves between the logs, fanning a spark to flame, igniting. Like islands, like dreams, I wonder if silence has the potential to operate as a kind of liminal space, as a space that is both inside and outside, a space where anything is possible. Silence is the common landscape across which we cast our voices when we transcend boundaries of space and distance by putting the trauma of our personal experience into conversation with the trauma of history. Silence as active call and response. the voices of the I and you pitching back and forth across the expanse, shaping and reshaping one another until our always undulating proximity sculpts a terrain of the page, a body, a landscape, a home. Because silence is something we all carry within ourselves. Inside our DNA and bodies, the stories lost to us, shrouded, buried, unmarked, nameless, faceless. And in this sense, silence isn't just the absence of language, but another language, a shared language, with the potential to act not just as an indication of distance, but also as a potential bridge that might speak both to the silences of history and to the continuing erasures of our present day. I am in many ways a child of silence, and I'm still discovering how to write my way into these silences. I think we need to learn not just how to surmount silence, but to understand the ways in which it shapes us, how it molds us to mountains or cuts a river through our hearts, how it makes a terrain of us. We have an obligation to speak out against the systemic injustice woven into America's history since its inception. And part of that work means breaking open and exploring histories that have been silenced to us. But I think there is also an obligation to actively engage with archival and historic silence carefully and with nuance if we are to understand the silences of this present moment. Silence comes in many forms and with complex motivations. Silence has its own voice. It cannot simply be talked over. It requires a thorough accounting. What are the stories we carry within ourselves that we can't access? The things about our own history and identity that have been lost in the quest for the safety afforded by assimilation and erasure. The stories our parents can't tell us because their parents chose not to tell them. And what can those stories or their absences teach us? What are the times when we should have spoken out and did not? When has silence made us complicit? When has our silence been driven by shame? And when has it made us ashamed? When have we been silenced by others, either individually or systemically? When have we told someone else to hold their tongue for fear of making waves? What are the pieces of history we have missed due to silence? And what are the aspects of our present society that we can't see clearly due to silence? What is it we are afraid to speak, and why? This is his trap. When I wrote Midden, I thought I was writing a book about the long ago. Even as I found ways for the poems to collapse my own distance from this terrible event, even as I pitched the voices of the poems back and forth between present and past, between myself and those long dead, I thought this. I first began writing poems about Malaga in 2008, but as I worked on the book over the years, current events and the history of this 1912 atrocity in Maine cycled closer and closer together. It wasn't until the book began its final stages towards publication in 2016 that I truly realized how closely the present was beginning to resemble the past. And by the time the book was published in 2018, and I began to read aloud from the book at events, it no longer struck me as a book about history at all, but as a book about the terrifying and painful moment of American history that we are now inside. When I read poems about Lizzie Marks being separated from her young son when they were committed to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, I realized I was reading a poem about the separation of children from their families at our southern border. When I read a poem about the photographic exploitation of Abby Marks, Pearlie Marks, and Andy Parker, I realized I was writing a poem about the violent present-day media exploitation of Black and brown bodies. When I read a poem about the fragmentation of the Malaga archive, I realized I was writing a poem about a racist systemic erasure that continues unchecked to this day. The moment of connection to history finally came for me. And when it did not at all look like what I thought or hoped it would be. As I write this talk, I feel the hinges of the trap closing. Over a century has passed since the Malaga Island eviction and erasure that it seems as if nothing has really changed. The only thing I can say with any certainty is that by writing Midden, I myself have changed. My understanding of history changed. My understanding of silence changed. And my understanding of my own responsibility changed. And while there have been many times over the past few years when my belief in language's ability to affect change has been crushed, my knowledge of my own personal journey through the process of writing this book does give me some small, stubborn hope. So here we are. History has reached out. It has grabbed a hold of our throats. And the question now is what we will write, and even more importantly, what will we do? I want to end by reading a poem that's not mine. This is a poem by Eve Ewing from her book 1919, which is an incredible poetic account of the 1919 Chicago race riots. This poem is called Sightseers, and it begins with two epigraphs. The first epigraph, almost all of the poems in the book have an epigraph from this study that was written in 1922 called The Negro in Chicago, a study of race relations in a race riot. So sightseers, the first epigraph. Often the sightseers, and even those included in the nucleus, did not know why they had taken part in crimes, the viciousness of which was not apparent to them until afterward. And the second epigraph is from Hannah Arendt, The Life of the Mind. The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. Just this once, I hope you'll forgive me for writing a somewhat didactic poem. I just didn't know how else to say that we live in a time of sightseers, standing on the bridge of history, watching the water go by. There are bodies in the water, and the water has been dirty for so long, and the sightseers still drink from it. They buy special filters and they smile. They have nice glasses and teacups. They put sugar in the dirty water that has our bodies in it. And there are sightseers seated beneath the tower empire, peering up at the lights. And there are children in the tower. And the tower has been crooked for so long. And the sightseers still look at it. They find the lights enchanting. They meet up on the weekends. They have picnics in the plaza of the tower that has our children in it. And there are sightseers looking at the house of power, waiting to take a tour. And there are devils in the house, and the house has been wicked for so long. And the sightseers still worship it. They stand in front and take pictures. They marvel at the white pillars. They send postcards of the house that has the devils in it. And just this once, I hope you'll forgive me for asking you directly to forget the lovely water, to forget the charming pillars, because there are children in the tower. There are children in the tower. There are children in the tower, and they are dead already. So thank you to those of you who made it through that. I guess if we want to do the questions, I am. We go to the chat. Hello? Is anyone still with me here? All right. Thank you. I'm gonna take a sip of water here.
Okay, I think I saw Hannah's hand go up, and thank you for. Oh no, okay.
I was just applauding.
Oh, you were applauding. Oh,
Yes.
well, yes, absolutely.
Sorry for the confusion.
So, if anybody would like to be the first to take the challenge of breaking silence after that eloquent presentation, I'm looking for hands. Okay, I see Wendy. And you should be ready to talk, Wendy. There you go.
Thank you so much. That was really, really amazing. Thank you. Yeah, so my question is how hard and involved and in-depth that whole project was for you. And I know how all of us now are in a difficult place in our, and I'm wondering, had you been writing something before this pandemic hit, and how might that pandemic and the racist, I mean, and the protests, how has that maybe affected the project that you had been on, or has this given you some impetus for the future? Can't hear. Can't hear.
Oh, Julia's muted.
Oh, okay.
Ben, could you unmute Julia?
I'm not sure how that happened, and now I'm looking to find her. There we go.
It won't.
There, you should be unmuted.
Oh, there. Okay. It didn't want to let me for a second there. Sorry. Wendy, thank you for that question. I started writing a new manuscript. I wrote a first draft of a new manuscript in February this year while I was up at Monson Arts. And it's interesting because it didn't have the pandemic in it yet, but it's definitely a book that is exploring, it feels like an evolution to me from Midden, where I'm applying some of what I learned from Midden toward my own history. So thinking about, Jewish ancestry in terms of assimilation and erasure, American Judaism, secular Judaism in that sense, thinking about my relationship to the land. But all of it with a really political lens, with this sense of threat coming, of this sort of building fear. And so there's some poetry. There's a piece in there that's about protest. It's not about this protest, but it's about something that happened to me when I spoke out against something that I didn't like in my community last summer. So there are pieces, there are all these sort of elements. And when I got home and I read, during the pandemic lockdown, I started reading this book back. I was like, okay, it's already, it has this sort of feeling of a freight train coming on you, even though the pandemic wasn't in it. Or at least that's how the book feels to me right now. So I've written some pandemic poems, and I've tried to, I'm working on trying to figure out how those fit into the book. But I guess my feeling with the book is that I need the time to sit and edit it, and yet I don't have that time because everything is moving at this alarming speed, it feels like right now. So, I mean, I'm negotiating that as best I can. Does that answer your question at all? Or just raise more questions? Oh, now you're mute. You're muted. I can't.
Okay. Yeah, because I was having sort of a conversation with Jeffrey Harrison, who had put a poem up in Plume that did talk about the pandemic and the way people were during the pandemic. And then he just said to me, it seems somehow not relevant now that we've had these global protests.
Yeah.
And I can't even remember a time when we needed to, or we were sort of bombarded with things that we generally, sort of like the purpose of writing has been, the foundation of whatever writing, the psyche that you had when you started writing the book has been sort of shaken by the emotional and political and just horrible landscape that has surrounded us recently. And it's hard to know in what way. I mean, I feel like there's no point in trying to respond with immediacy unless you're willing to take that response and maybe then subsequently mull over it.
Yeah.
And to allow it to see how it might be part of a larger picture, one that you were, just, that's all.
I agree with that. I mean, I'm a slow writer, and I agree with that. And I feel like I'm trying to work at a certain speed that's not natural because history is moving, feels like it's moving very quickly right now. I think that's okay. I mean, I think you capture what you can and then you come back later. And often when you're writing about one thing, you're writing about something else at the same time anyway. And that, I think, can come through once you arrange things into a book. So, I mean, I don't always know how it's going to work until it works out, but I do have a strong trust the process streak.
Thanks.
Their hands waving. I don't have the power though. Ben, are you trying to unmute someone?
Is that better?
Yes, I'm trying.
I think
There
it
we
worked.
go.
Is that better? Thanks, Ben.
Yes, I can hear.
Well, I started by just saying thank you, Julia. This is so powerful and so timely. I'm glad I logged in. You mentioned there are a couple things that I wanted to circle back to, but I'll start with one in case someone else has a question. But you mentioned, you were talking about the power of silence as maybe a double-edged sword, or definitely as a double-edged sword. And you mentioned that silence can be a language in and of itself. I'm probably torturing how you mentioned it, but I immediately had this flashback to, it seems so appropriate right now with police officers standing silent in the midst of violence, code blues and things like that.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about silence as a language of itself? And quickly, my second question was, you talked also about your fears of maybe, misappropriating somebody's story. Can you tell us how you got over those fears and when you just somehow jump that hoop?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I somehow jumped the hoop. I might say that I stumbled through it slowly. But I mean, one of the things that I did was make sure that I got second readers from my book who were poets that I deeply respected, but also who are poets of color, because they didn't really judge my, I didn't necessarily trust my ability to see certain things because of that silence, because that's what whiteness does, and makes it hard sometimes for us to identify things we take for granted. So I needed other perspectives, and that was helpful to me. I mean, the thing about silence that makes it so complicated in my mind is that silence, is this oppressive force, but it is also a survival mechanism. And silence is what has allowed many people to be alive today. Things like changing one's name or anglicizing one's name, or, all kinds, not, in some ways I think that, all these kinds of assimilation and erasure and often, that are in the direction of moving towards whiteness, often those kind of silences are problematic, but they also are an act of survival. So it's really complicated, to say that silence is a bad thing in and of itself, totally. But I think what really interests me thinking about silence is that it feels very universal. And so I wonder about it as a point of connection. And I think that in terms of writing from history and writing from archive, I think that the impulse is to feel like you're writing against silence. And I think that was a lot of what tripped me up in the early versions of writing the book. And I think that when I stopped thinking about it in terms of that kind of binary, it helped open up the poems for me. I don't know if I quite said anything new, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, yes, that's very helpful.
Okay, I am looking at the broader view of folks. Okay, it looks like, Candace, you might have some questions from Facebook? Or, kudos, like people are just saying good things, right? Okay. Misunderstood, sorry. Oh, it looks like Duncan has a question, and if you can unmute yourself, I've changed that setting, so you should be able to unmute yourself. There we go.
Yes.
So about the positive use of silence, I wanted to ask you, in what way are the people that you've written about real to you? What kind of reality do they have? And my point of reference is, I've had a lifelong dialogue with Abraham Lincoln, but I would never say that I feel like I have a personal relationship with him.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it feels like it's cloaked in silence. I mean, it's almost like a sacred spot. I wouldn't dare to have a personal relationship with him, even though I've been doing this for years. And I wonder how you hold the quote unquote reality of the people that you've spoken of and to.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the one hand, I should say that I have, in real life, in physical reality, spoken to descendants of this event, and they are very much real people. They are real people, and they're real people to me. So there's this very kind of, they're actual people today that in some ways are representations or carrying forth, not representations, that's the wrong word, but they do in some way, they have that connection, to voices that feel more ambiguous to me. So I think that when I say that we all carry ghosts inside of us, I think that's what I mean, is that, when we walk around, we are somehow representing our ancestors. We're there because of them. and we're representing them in some way. And maybe if they could see us, they would be horrified, and maybe they would be very proud, and it's hard to say, and we don't know. But I think but that's a very real thing. So when I started to think about, this idea of talking to ghosts and talking to silence in the book, there is a merger that happens here where the ghosts that I'm writing to in these epistolary poems are the people of Malaga. But they are also, they're also my own ancestors that I didn't know. They are also people, there's a cemetery on my property in New Portland, Maine. There's a small cemetery. This land was a farmhouse, was started as a farm in the 1820s, and by the paternal great-grandparents of Edna St. Vincent Millay. And so her relatives are buried in my property. So when I think about my land, I sort of think of them as the ancestors of my land, and that I've, in some ways, stumbled onto that lineage as well.
These merge for you.
Yeah, so for me, the ghosts they're both very concrete, but they're also able to be in more than one place at once, and able to be more than one person at once, because ghosts can do that,
You dream about them?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, in different ways. I don't know that it's always that explicit, but I have, yeah.
Have you read Lincoln in the Bardo by George Sanders?
I haven't read the whole thing.
How did it strike you?
I think it's really interesting. I can see where you're coming from with this question and this idea. Yeah. I confess that I didn't get all the way through it, but it's not a condemnation of the book, maybe of just there's too many things on my plate syndrome. But but I think it's really interesting. What was your take on that book?
I had a hard time with it.
Yeah.
I really did, and I'm not sure why.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting concept and probably hard to pull off, but I haven't read it well enough to continue to talk on it, unfortunately.
What about Lizzie Bright, that children's novel?
Yeah, I've read that.
Did you like that?
I think that I like it for what it is, which is, a pretty good way to introduce this history to kids. And I know a lot of teachers who found it to be a really useful text. Yeah. Obviously, it's trying to apply a much more straightforward narrative as a piece of fiction than the approach that I took.
Yeah.
And I think that it doesn't necessarily take the point of focus I might have if I were writing it, but I think what's really exciting there's a Midden, so to speak, of materials and works of visual art, of literature, of performance that's being created all toward this, and it's all taking different angles and approaches, and that too is where you see the connection between the personal and the historic, because what approach one takes relates to your own experience and how you view things. So I think that's really exciting to me.
Thanks.
So can Barbara unmute herself? Will that work? Thanks.
Hi, Julie.
Hi.
When did you at one point sense that the ghosts or the people wanted you to write about them?
I don't know. I mean, I don't.
Well, you felt strongly about doing this, so
yeah.
As you thought about it and you were very serious about doing it right. So I was just wondering if you were sort of a voice for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think poets, you know, as a poet, I feel like I write about a poem. I'll write a poem is where I go to try to work on something that is haunting me, you know, or to try to not necessarily create explanations for things, because I really don't want to do that. I'm not really interested in that, but to honor something that doesn't make sense to me, and to make space for something that feels too large for me to process. And I think in that sense, that's very much why I was drawn. And so that's why I say that, you know, this was a story that haunted me. And that, you know, I feel like what I need to do is to write into the things that haunt me. You know, as for, you know, to what extent that's a real physical experience and to what extent that's slightly a metaphor, I can't quite tell you. I think that's, you know, as a poetic experience, those things can merge.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do feel very strongly about, you know, about the responsibility we have to history, which is complicated and I think can't be taken lightly. Hi, John. Did you want to unmute yourself?
Oh,
You're muted.
no, I'm not unmuted now,
Now
right?
you're unmuted, yes.
So I was interested in the fact when you were in Peru and visiting those sacrificial sites, you weren't able to sort of project yourself into that scene, whereas
Yeah.
with Malaga, you are able to. How would you characterize the difference? I mean, why do you think that would be?
I think it was because I wanted it too much. I think it was like an asking too loudly. And I think that my own desire to have that connection took up too much space in the room and didn't allow, you know, history its own space and its own voice. So I think that's an example where if I had been more comfortable with the silence, if I had been more willing to accept that that's what I felt in the moment, I think that there would have been. Does that make sense? I think it's, you know, it's about not being comfortable dwelling with that silence.
Yeah, I wonder if it might also have something to do with, you know, there weren't so many hooks.
I mean,
with the Malaga thought there were all kinds of, you know, little bits of evidence and things that would kind of personalize the people a little bit, you know, newspaper articles, photographs, whereas in Peru there was only the stones and your knowledge of what had happened there without really any more graphic evidence of it.
yeah, I don't know, maybe. I mean, like I said, in some ways it's a memory that became parable. So in the sense of parable, I've sort of chosen what I've made of it. But
well,
it could be, you know, I think that it's an interesting thing because the story of Malaga does, I guess, have hooks, but it also has these enormous silences inside of it.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing, I think. Yeah, to think about. I tend to have different answers for these at different times because I will continue to process and over process it forever, but. I think, are we?
Yeah, I think we may have,
Yeah.
yeah. Is there anything last minute that anyone wanted to ask? I'm not seeing anything. Thank you so much, Julia. This has been just a presentation of unbelievable depth and very much appreciate you speaking to us all today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the Bangor Library and to Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance for having me here today. It was lovely to see most of your faces. Thank you.
Well,
So we
as
just
people,
leave meeting, right? Is that how this ends?
yes. As people leave, be looking out for a survey to let us know what we can do better. Besides me learning how to unmute better, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye.